Now to move on to our speaker for the day, Dr. Mina Yazdani, born in Iran. While the Islamic Revolution was going on, she was at that very time a medical student, but was of course kicked out of school because she was a Baha'i. She then completed her initial education through Indiana University, went on to Landig International University for a master's degree, and then finally in 2004, she was able to go to Canada, where she obtained a master's degree in religion and culture from Wilfrid Laurier University, and then later obtained a PhD from the Department of Near and Middle Eastern Studies Civilizations at the University of Toronto. Very, very important institution for these things. And one of her main areas for a long time has been the Iranian Constitutional Revolution, the beginning of the 20th century. She's an expert about that. Currently, she's an associate professor of history at Eastern Kentucky University. She's published articles in many, many different journals, including the Journal of Baha'i Studies Review, Iran Studies, Iran Nameh, Iran Namag, and also, of course, articles, entries in the Encyclopedia Iranica, often on Baha'i topics, but not always. So today, Mina is going to be presenting about the writings and utterances of Abdu'l-Bahá based on a chapter that she wrote in an upcoming volume called The World of the Baha'i Faith, which will be published by Routledge Press in January of 2022. So I now want to turn the program over to Mina. Mina, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to the Wilmette Institute's webinar series, and we're very much looking forward to hearing you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I wish I knew every one of you as the audience. That would have made my life and lecture much easier. But just imagining that we are all friends, I feel already comfortable. So, as Rob said, I'm going to speak about the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá. When we talk about the writings and actually utterances of Abdu'l-Bahá, when we talk about his writings, we are talking about the writings of a very prolific writer for something like 60 years. And also the talks of a great speaker who gave talks, as you well know, mostly during his travels to the West, and of course in every occasion that was needed, even before and after that. So Abdu'l-Bahá, for Baha'is, is the vice-gerent of Baha'u'llah. He is the interpreter of his writings. He is the perfect exemplar of his teachings. And of course, he is the center of Baha'u'llah's covenant. As I go through his writings, we see that how these roles actually are reflected in what he wrote and, of course, in the speeches that he gave. With regards to the number of his tablets, let me first share my screen because I think that would make our job a little bit easier. I asked the research department of the Universal House of Justice about a reliable statistic of the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá, and this is based on the response that I got from them. They estimate that there are over 8,000 unique works of Abdu'l-Bahá, and by unique, they mean unrepeated works of his. And of course, these are from a very wide spectrum in terms of their length, from very short letters to lengthy books, as we know. And then the types of his writings also, we know that go from books to treatises, that is a shorter version of books, and tablets, the letters that he wrote to groups, to individuals and societies, and then the utterances, speeches that he gave and then reviewed and approved for publication, that we have now 3 volumes of in Persian khatabat, and some answered questions and memorials of the faithful. So these are a particular category of his works. They were first expressed orally and then authorized by himself and then published. So their station is equal to what he wrote and published. And then we have his prayers and a number of his poems as well. With regards to the themes of his writings, they are very diverse, from spiritual, which includes, of course, moral, ethical topics, theological, philosophical, mystical, social, historical, and about the exegetical, which means the interpretation of the writings of divine books, including, of course, the writings of Baha'u'llah himself, and scientific issues and psychological. Issues that are related to the administrative order, I would categorize as both spiritual and social. He wrote in 3 languages: Persian. 82% of his writings are in Persian or mixed Arabic and Persian. There are many tablets or letters written by him that are partly in Persian and partly in Arabic. 16% are only in Arabic, and the rest 2% in Turkish. We have to know a number of general considerations about his writings. First of all, it's important to know that everything that we see in the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá has its roots in the writings of Baha'u'llah. In other words, he did not invent anything in the Baha'i faith. All he did was based on Baha'u'llah's writings. And almost all of his writings, I can say really almost all, contain a Quranic reference. The Quran is very present, in a sense, in the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá through allusions, references that he makes to various chapters and verses of the Quran. And another characteristic of his writings is that he incorporates many things, poems, tales, and sometimes even parables, stories, and his connection with the Persian literature is amazing. Even though he lived most of his life away from Iran, his familiarity with Persian literature, both poems and prose, is impressive, as reflected in his writings. I want to talk about the best way to approach the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá, and that is through the writings of the guardian, Shoghi Effendi. In fact, it is Shoghi Effendi who tells us how to look at each piece of the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá. The way that Shoghi Effendi has described his writings basically determines the status of that piece of writing within the Baha'i canon. I'm going to classify the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá on a chronological order, and I'm going to divide his writings into 4 different periods. One is during the ministry of Baha'u'llah, that is, Baha'u'llah still is in his earthly life, and Abdu'l-Bahá is practically his basically de facto agent, or he represents Baha'u'llah in all social situations. And then from the beginning of his own ministry, that is after the accession of Baha'u'llah, to the time of his travels to the West, that is from 1892 to 1910, and then during his travels to the West, the 3 years that he was in Europe and the United States together. And after his return to the Holy Land to the end of his life, that is 1913 to 1921. I'm going also to make connections between each of these periods with one of his stations that I have already mentioned. So, during the time when Baha'u'llah was still living and Abdu'l-Bahá was practically his de facto deputy, that is from 1863 to 1892, he wrote at Baha'u'llah's instruction. When Baha'u'llah wanted him to write something, he would say, and then Abdu'l-Bahá would obey. The earliest recorded and published writing of his is a letter that he wrote actually from the Garden of Rizwan during the stay of Baha'u'llah and his family in the Garden of Rizwan. He writes a letter to a relative in Mazandaran and explains how in the past 3 years during that time, the Persian authorities were pressing the Ottomans to return Baha'u'llah back to Iran, and how finally this story ended with Baha'u'llah's further exile from Baghdad. And Shoghi Effendi actually translates a part of this letter, which when you calculate Abdu'l-Bahā's age, he was 18, beginning 19 perhaps during those days. Then other writings of Abdu'l-Bahá during this period include several commentaries on the Quranic chapters or verses, or a number of hadith in Quranic studies and for Muslims. It refers to the sayings of the Prophet himself, or for the Shias also imams, and they're very important for the Muslims. So a number of these ahadith or traditions or hadiths, because the word basically has entered into English language, so you can make a plural of it. And also some of the verses, 2 exact verses of Qayyum al-Asma, the Bab's first work, appears in the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá during this time. And then also, I'm going to talk a little bit more about these commentaries, but just to make my list almost complete, I want to say that 2 of his books were written during this time, The Secret of Divine Civilization and A Traveler's Narrative. Now, the commentaries that Abdu'l-Bahá wrote on sacred texts of other religions not only reflected the fundamental Baha'i belief in the unity of all religions, but also sought to unravel the hidden meanings of these texts and relate them to Baha'u'llah's revelation. Shoghi Effendi, sorry, I just want to talk to you a bit more about these commentaries of Abdu'l-Bahá on the Quranic verses particularly. When Baha'u'llah and his family arrived in Akka in that last part of his exile, and he wanted Abdu'l-Bahá to have classes on the Quran for the believers, and it is assumed that these commentaries of Abdu'l-Bahá on the Quranic verses or chapters relate to somehow to those classes. Perhaps they are the fruits of those classes that Abdu'l-Bahá had in Akka at the instruction of Baha'u'llah. Then we have, during this very important period, we have The Secret of Divine Civilization, that Abdu'l-Bahá wrote when he was 31 years old. Baha'u'llah wanted Abdu'l-Bahá to write something that would decrease the prejudices of the bigot so that they are more prepared to listen to his divine message. And he wanted Abdu'l-Bahá to write it about the factors that would lead to reconstruction of the world and factors that cause basically the ruin of the world. Abdu'l-Bahá chose the process of reform that at the time, or a little bit before that time, I'm talking about 1875 when the book was written, a little bit earlier than that, like 2 years earlier than that, a process of reform had begun in Iran that the Shah, Nasruddin Shah of the time, was supportive of it. Abdu'l-Bahá uses this framework in order to basically write about his divine guidance in the book. He does not identify himself as the author. He basically publishes the book without the name of the author being there. And he explains at the beginning that he's doing this in order to show that he really does not wish any particular gain for himself as the author, and to show that it's only pure good intention for the reader and for the people of Iran that he is writing the book. So at the time, because of the process of reform that had begun, a reaction against the reform was also going on in Iran. The Muslim clerics, the ulama, and some of the Qajar princes were totally against the process of reform. So Abdu'l-Bahá uses this opportunity to basically talk about the real reform and real reconstruction being basically not just about the material aspect of human life, but also about the spiritual, moral, ethical issues. And also then he talks about how it would not hurt Iranians if they adopt some of the positive aspects of Western civilization. And at the same time, he reminded them and any other reader, of course, of the problems of European culture and civilization. In other words, he's not advocating the imitation of Western culture the way it was, and he does acknowledge its shortcomings, but it also tells Iranians that it wouldn't hurt their collective life if they do accept the European technology, for example, that was part of the process of reform. And then in The Secret of Divine Civilization, of course, he brings in the sublime ideas of Baha'u'llah about what true civilization looks like and how real civilization is connected to the notion of world peace, and his advice and suggestion for the establishment of world peace and true civilization. And that is why the Guardian, Shoghi Effendi, describes this book as Abdu'l-Bahā's outstanding contribution to the future reorganization of the world. So even though the context of the book is Iran, the application of Abdu'l-Bahā's message goes far beyond that. So that you see the Guardian describes the book as such. This was one of the first Baha'i books published. Actually, after the Kitab-e-Iqan, The Secret of Divine Civilization was only the second one to be published in Bombay, India. The next book that Abdu'l-Bahá wrote during the lifetime of Baha'u'llah is called A Traveler's Narrative. From Abdu'l-Bahā's own writings, we see that he describes the book as the correct and brief history of the of the new religion. The title is about the episode of the Bab, as he calls it, but the content also includes parts of the Baha'i history, that is, what happened after Baha'u'llah announced himself as him whom God shall make manifest, as the promised one of the Bab. And in this, there is a clear message that from the Baha'i point of view, from Abdu'l-Bahā's point of view, what we see unfolding in the Baha'i faith is the natural continuation of the episode of the Bab. It's basically the same notion that we have as the two revelations, in a sense, being one and the same. This then takes me to the next period in the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá, that is after Baha'u'llah passed away and after his ascension. During this time, from 1892 to 1910, because of the circumstances, because of the situation in the life of Abdu'l-Bahá, what was going on in the Ottoman Empire, the reactions that Abdu'l-Bahā's half-brother Muhammad Ali showed to his position. Because of all of these things, the central theme really can be defined as the covenant and the protection of the faith. So his role as the center of Baha'u'llah's covenant is reflected clearly not only during all of his ministry, but in particular during this time period. So we all know, as I think Baha'is, that Abdu'l-Bahā's half-brother basically resisted the covenant. So he had to basically deal with this issue. And I'm going to talk about what he did and what he wrote with regard to that particular issue. But this provides some context for one of his major writings during this period. 1 year after the ascension of Baha'u'llah, during the first year of the Abdu'l-Bahā's period as the center of the covenant, something very important is going on in Iran. It is a period of political turmoil. Anti-governmental activities have started, and the followers of Mirza Yahya Azal, known in Iran as Azalis, are politically active, and actually they are collaborating with the forces that are active against the central government. So the Baha'is of Iran are basically facing a very difficult and at the same time quite a new situation. So how are they going to react? Of course, Baha'u'llah had already in his Kitab Aqdas made it clear that Baha'is were not going to oppose the legal government of their country. But at the same time, Baha'is also knew that the Qajars, that is the dynasty ruling in Iran at the time, were so brutal to the followers of the new religion. So what should they do in this situation? At the same time, for the government of Iran, perhaps it had become clear during the lifetime of Baha'u'llah that through the writings of Baha'u'llah himself, for example, the tablet of Nasir ad-Din Shah that Baha'u'llah, in which made it clear for the Shah, for the king, that Baha'is are not going to be acting against the government. They knew that about Baha'u'llah himself. Now, the question was perhaps for them, what about Baha'u'llah's successor? What about this new head of the Baha'i community? So Abdu'l-Bahá, in the midst of all this situation, had to make it clear for the Iranian government, for Baha'is, for the Iranian nation in general, that Baha'is are not going to take part in anti-governmental activities, and at the same time, Abdu'l-Bahá finds it necessary to advise Iranians against accepting or promoting political roles for the ulama, the clerics, and warned them. As he basically says, that the essence or the summary of this treatise that he wrote during this time, the treatise on politics, he says the essence of this treatise is that the interference of the ulama in political affairs leads to dire outcomes. So the treatise, on the one hand, I can call it something like a manifesto, if I'm allowed to use that word, making it clear where Baha'is stand vis-a-vis this situation, new political situation in Iran, the political turmoil that is going on, and at the same time to warn Iranians against the interference of the ulama in political affairs. The interesting thing about the treatise, which is actually a very short booklet, is that Abdu'l-Bahá wanted Baha'is to share it with everybody. Anyone who was working in an organization, in an office, Abdu'l-Bahá wanted them to share it with their co-workers, their boss, and he even sent one of the prominent Baha'is to the Shah with a copy of this book. The next piece of writings of Abdu'l-Bahá during this time is his most significant writing, that is his Will and Testament. The Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá is his most significant piece of work because The Guardian actually calls it his greatest legacy to posterity and the brightest emanation of his mind and the charter of a future world civilization and the charter of Baha'u'llah's new world order. So he adds actually in his other writings to all these very emphatic and important descriptions that the Will and Testament was also one of the texts that supplement the Kitab Aqdas, Baha'u'llah's most holy book. All the other texts that the Guardian defines as supplementary to the Kitab Aqdas are written by Baha'u'llah himself. The Will and Testament is the only piece of the sacred Baha'i writings that is not from Baha'u'llah, is from Abdu'l-Bahá, and is still considered as supplementary to the Kitab Aqdas. So about the timing of the three pieces of this work, from the clues in the text, we can say that they have been written, the first part was written in late 1905 or early 1906, and the second and third part were written around 1907. I think any vibrant Baha'i community with these descriptions that we see from the Guardian regarding Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Bahá has every reason to devote particular time to the study of the Will and Testament, particularly in this year that we are commemorating the centenary of his passing. So the next work written or prepared, let me be a little bit more accurate, during this time is Abdu'l-Bahā's Some Answered Questions. These are his questions to, his answers to the questions posed by a brilliant young American woman, Laura Clifford Barney, whom I personally really impressed by her knowledge, her intelligence, and her best use of time. I think the Baha'i world forever is really grateful, should be grateful to Laura Clifford Barney for asking questions from Abdu'l-Bahá during the time that they had for eating during the lunchtime when she was staying at the Holy Land. She knew some Persian, but despite that, she used interpreters at the beginning, apparently not in the latter part of the compiling of her questions and their answers. So the result is this fantastic book, Some Answered Questions, that basically it includes many things from Abdu'l-Bahā's interpretation of some Christian concepts including, for example, Trinity, including Jesus's resurrection, many important Christian notions. So a very wide range of questions she asked and Abdu'l-Bahá answered. They include such questions, and then they go on to include some of the more contemporary issues at the time, for example, the issue of workers' strike, or a very important scientific discussion going at the time, that was going on at the time, the theory of evolution that Laura Barney knew well about and asked Baha'u'llah, asked Abdu'l-Bahá about it. Really, as I said, we owe this brilliant young American woman a lot. And actually, Some Answered Questions, when it was published, it was one of the first Baha'i works to attract the attention of an American journalist that published a short piece about it in Washington Herald at the time in 1909, April 28, 1909. The second, the other part of his writings that I'm going to talk to you about are a group of his writings that in Persian and Arabic we call his makatib, because that's the word that he chose, makatib being the plural for maktub, which meant letters. And Abdu'l-Bahá, because of his genuine humility, that's the word that he used for these correspondences that he had with individuals. Sometimes with the individuals, with groups of people, with institutions. He wrote these letters throughout his life. But in my work, I had to locate them, to put them in one of these four categories or four periods that I had. And I thought, because perhaps this was the longest and the most important in terms of his relationship with the community, I just arbitrarily located these, put this in this category. He wrote every day. Every day, that would not be an exaggeration. And during one particular period of Iranian history, when he had to guide Baha'is on a daily basis, it is recorded that he wrote 90 letters per day. I mean, it is unbelievable. We're going to talk about that period and why he had to do that. And his tablets, as we call in English, we call these letters the tablets, were estimated in a letter from the Universal House of Justice's Research Department in 1983 to be 27,000. I'm going to just highlight some of his most important tablets, but before that, perhaps let me also share with you this practical issue that how did he write these tablets? Did he close the door and didn't see anybody and sat down and wrote the tablets? No, actually, most of these tablets, based on the memoirs of those who witnessed the events, were written in situations in which he had guests around to whom sometimes he was speaking in Turkish, and then he was at the same time dictating a letter in Persian to one of his secretaries and writing another one in Arabic. So if you don't believe me, just go read Yunus Khan Afrokhta's memoirs, 9 years in Akka. Fortunately, it has been translated by a dedicated soul and it has been published. So Yunus Khan has been observant enough and to see this and then write it for us to know these exemplary writings in terms of their beauty and their content, in what situation he wrote them, really. Some of the more important tablets I have here on the slide. The two tablets of 1,000 verses. These two are titled as such because of their length. They were written on the issue of the covenant because Muhammad Ali, Abdul-Bahá's half-brother, was creating a lot of problem in terms of not accepting Abdul-Bahá's authority. So Abdul-Bahá wrote these two tablets to two of the believers. One was Abul Faza'il Golpaegani, perhaps the greatest Baha'i scholar of the first century. He wrote this tablet to him in 1897, and the other he wrote a year after, in 1898. Then I want to talk about a series of the tablets of Abdul-Bahá, many tablets of Abdul-Bahá, actually. I have not been able to count them, but a contemporary of Abdul-Bahá and the contemporary of the historical period that I'm going to talk about, that is the Iranian Constitutional Revolution from 1905 to 1911, Muhammad Alaqaband Yazdi, who actually even wrote a history of the Constitutional Revolution. Muhammad Alaqaband Yazdi tells us that during the year 1907, when there was, after the establishment of the Iranian First Parliament, or in Persian Arabic we call it Majlis, there was a lot of conflict going on between the Majlis, or the Parliament, and the court and the king. So on the one hand the king, and on the other hand the Majlis, and the Anjumans or societies that were supporting the Majlis. Muhammad Alaqaband Yazdi tells us that during the 9 months that he had in mind from the beginning of the formation of the Majlis, something around 200 tablets were written by Abdul-Bahá, addressing the Baha'is of Iran, guiding them on what to do. And here I want to highlight one of the themes in these writings that, as a historian of Iran, I consider the service that Abdul-Bahá was rendering the people of Iran as a nation at the time. That he was, at the same time, based on his own writings, he was advising and guiding the both sides, both the Shah and the Majlis, the more radical elements of the Majlis perhaps, that unless these two intermingle like honey and milk, the problems of Iran will not be solved, and the ground will be prepared for the foreign powers to interfere in the affairs of Iran. Sadly, his message was not listened to, and the dire circumstance led to the consequence that he had predicted. And we see after this period that the interference of the two superpowers, Russia and Britain, in the affairs of Iran became much more than before, as he had predicted. Then at the end of this period, we have a tablet called the Two Calls to Success and Prosperity. This was written when Abdu'l-Bahá, that was just was released from incarceration because of the political changes that happened in Ottoman Empire in 1908. Now he had some peace of mind to write about what was at the heart of the message of Baha'u'llah, the universal message of Baha'u'llah, that material and spiritual civilization go hand in hand. So this tablet is basically a sign of the great fruits of his mind when it could concentrate on what was the real message of Baha'u'llah and what was at the heart of the message of Baha'u'llah. So now with this, I move on to talk about this particularly important period of his life, his travels in the West. In these years, from as we all know, from 1910 to 1913, he went first to Europe, then to the United States, then he came back to Europe. He gave speeches in many different places. He was invited to many universities, to churches, to synagogues, to the places where the groups that believed in certain ideas gathered together. So in various places he was invited and gave talks. In his talks, actually, this is the period that I think we can connect this period in particular with his position as the interpreter of the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá. It's in this period that he basically crystallizes the teachings of Baha'u'llah in terms of very clear teachings. In some of his talks, and in all of his talks, he shares a number of these teachings. In some, he shares something like 8, in some he shares 12, and there is a talk actually in which he shares 21 of his of the principles of Baha'u'llah. Why is it that I'm emphasizing this point? Because due to the work of some very dedicated and knowledgeable souls, perhaps Iranian scholars, it has become kind of customary to think about the teachings of Baha'u'llah in terms of 12 teachings or 12 principles, whereas when you explore the speeches of Abdu'l-Bahá, which, as I said, can be considered as the ultimate crystallization of his role as the authorized interpreter of the writings of Baha'u'llah, you see that that number 12 is not really fixed. He basically has a number of them as mentioned in many talks, but others differ in different speeches. For example, the two teachings of the announcement of the unity of mankind and unfettered search after truth, these two are invariably there. Sometimes one is the first, sometimes the other, but they are the first and the second teaching that he usually shares. There are many things to share with you about his teaching, his talks, but with the recommendation that Rob just gave me, I have to shorten my talk. I want to just share one very interesting point with you, that Abdu'l-Bahá is recorded to have said that he was surprised how people would ask him, what are you going to talk about tonight? He said, I'm surprised, how can one say one wants to say before seeing the audience? That means he really accommodated his speech based on the situation. He created an environment of close connection with the audience, which he recognized how should proceed when he attended the gatherings. In two cases, he was asked to give the text of the talk prior to attending the meetings, and in both of those two settings, actually, he did not stick to the text that he had given before. So there are many interesting things to share with you, but perhaps this will lead you to get a copy of the book that Rob has edited to see what I had to say in that chapter about these talks. This takes me to the last part of his writings, the writings that we have from him after his return from his travels in the West, and that is from 1913 to 1921. In this period, he basically expands the horizon. He talks about world peace, about the propagation of the faith, and about the philosophy of the faith. So soon after the war begins, the war against which he had warned the people during his talks when he was in the West. Now, 2 months after the First World War began, saddened by the war, he wrote a tablet which is titled, in the original, it's titled Sautes Salam Am, the Call for Universal Peace, that can be described as an urgent and universal summon to peace. From the writings of some Iranian scholars at the time, we know that he even intended to send this tablet for publication in Times of London, but that did not happen. However, he managed to publish a translation of the tablet in December 1914 in Christian Commonwealth. In this tablet, Abdu'l-Bahá calls upon the states, the nations, the philosophers, the sages of the world, the dignitaries of the world, and finally humanity at large to reflect on the disastrous effects of the war and do all they can do to prevent its prolongation. So then we have a series of the tablets that all of you are familiar with, the tablets of Divine Plan, Faramine Tabliqi, that he wrote from 26 March 1916 to 8 March 1917. 14 tablets he wrote. You basically know that American and Canadian believers were the main audience. He exhorted them to spread the Baha'i teachings, both to all parts of their own countries and to the rest of the world. Because of your familiarity with these tablets, I can basically skip what I had to share with you on them. And I want to move on to talk about one of his works that is extremely close to my heart, and I'm sure to the heart of anybody who is familiar with the work. So during the war, when Abdu'l-Bahá was basically not able to connect with his believers around the world, what he did at nights, he allowed the Baha'is who were in the Holy Land to gather together around him, and he gave talks to them. And in his talks, he in each night he talked about one of the believers. So he talks about the life of 70 early believers in his weekly gatherings in Haifa. Some of those believers were prominent souls like Tahere, but some others, most others, were what we call ordinary believers. And what they shared was their dedication to the faith, their faithfulness to the faith. And as a Baha'i scholar has, in a very articulate language, I think, said, the memorials of the faithful can be considered as the democratization of sainthood. So if these souls are precious enough to be remembered by Abdu'l-Bahá, and basically for their stories to become part of the Baha'i canon, because even though he gave talks about them, later he authenticated them. And so these are part of the Baha'i writings. So those souls that are mentioned there, if saints have any meaning in the Baha'i writings, they must be these, right? But who are they? The cook, the tailor, the gardener. And I think that is the beauty of the work. And for your information, three scholars actually have published very good articles on the memorials of the faithful. During the year 1915 and 1916, that is when they were basically the talks were given. So in the anniversary, that's the centenary of the talks, these articles were published. Now, then his very important tablets to the Hague are basically we can say the tablets that he wrote for the executive committee of the Central Organization for a Durable Peace in The Hague. They encapsulate the requirements for the establishment of world peace from the Baha'i point of view. And we have now a book published on this topic. I think it was published last year by Dr. Mahmoudi. I'm sure some of you are familiar with it. And the last important tablet, I'm sure after the 21st September 1921, when he wrote this tablet 67 days before his passing, I'm sure after that perhaps he had other shorter tablets, but this is perhaps his last very important tablet written to Professor August Forel, who was a Swiss entomologist and psychiatrist with a highly scientific mind. As you can imagine, he had asked questions about God and spirituality that Abdu'l-Bahá responded to. And with this, basically, Professor Forel was the cause for Abdu'l-Bahá leaving for the posterity a tablet that can be considered his last significant philosophical work. And I want to end my talk by reference to his prayers. Abdu'l-Bahá revealed prayers all throughout his ministry. Some of his prayers are basically incorporated in his tablets. Some are independent, some are more general, some have a specific theme, like, for example, healing. And there are prayers from him for the deceased. These categories, which in the tablets of visitation in Persian Arabic ziyaratname, are basically in Arabic, but his other prayers are in Persian, in Arabic, sometimes combined, and he has prayers in Turkish too. And based on a personal research, I can tell you that it wouldn't be too far off to claim that Abdu'l-Bahā's prayers do have a particular form and construct, an introduction, a body, and a conclusion, exploring the themes in each of which can be very revealing and truly a lesson to us about what he considered worthy of asking the manifestation of God for Baha'is. On that point, I think I can end my talk, and I guess we have still a few minutes for the questions.
Indeed, we do. Thank you so much, Mina. That was fascinating, and I was taking notes here. And one person, after you asked whether you could have more time, the person said, "We weren't going. We're not going anywhere. We'll be here." So I think you kept your audience's attention really quite well.
Thank you.
I was struck by your comment that the very first writing of Abdu'l-Bahá we have is a letter that he wrote during the Rezvan Garden. And
Yes.
I was wondering, what other letters do we have from Abdu'l-Bahá from this before he's the head of the faith period? Do we have a lot of letters to individuals, or not very many?
Not that I know of, really. I mean, Abdu'l-Bahá, during the lifetime of Baha'u'llah, this is my impression, I might be wrong. This is my impression that he wouldn't write unless Baha'u'llah wanted him to. And those writings that we have, the commentaries, for example, and the two books are of that nature. And now that we have time, if you have many questions, I stop, but I wish I had time to talk a little bit about one of those commentaries that it's basically his explanation of a very famous Islamic hadith or tradition. I was a hidden treasure, that is, kuntu kanzan makhfiyan. And Abdu'l-Bahá wrote it, Baha'u'llah explicitly says that Abdu'l-Bahá wrote it when they were in Edirne. And we have a letter from Gulpayegani, Abul Fazal Gulpayegani, that says Abdu'l-Bahá wrote it when he was 19. So combining these two pieces of information, one can assume that this was written shortly after the arrival in Edirne. Now, this, he writes at the age of 19. He himself says that he wrote it during his sabawat, kind of like childhood or early adulthood. And so this becomes one of the most important texts in Baha'i philosophy. Just from that, we can imagine who Abdu'l-Bahá was.
What other Quran commentaries of his do we have? Do we have a few of them, or just?
We have many. We have many. We have many. He basically, as I said, he wrote the commentary on the box, 2 verses from Qayyum al-Asma. Then let me give you a list of, to be more accurate. I trust the ink of the paper more than my memory. Let me bring this section on this and give you a list of his commentaries. So the commentaries that he wrote, he wrote commentaries on verses from several surahs of the Quran, including Surah Qalam, the pen, Surah Rad, thunder, Surah Kahf, the cave, Surah Jinn, and Surah Furqan, that is Criterion. Moreover, he wrote commentaries on a number of other hadiths and on the invocation of in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, with which almost all, not all, the chapters of the Quran begin. So Abdul-Bahā's commentary on Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim is one of his most important commentaries. And I think that's it. I have not listed anything else. And I already said that his Kontokan tafsir or commentary of Kontokans was very important. And actually that one is in Persian, whereas most of the commentaries are in Arabic. Yes.
Sure, that makes sense. It occurs to me that there's some parallel here with the periodicity of the writings of Baha'u'llah, because Baha'u'llah also starts with mystical topics and with philosophical religious topics.
Wow.
And
Very
then here we
interesting.
have in these Quran commentaries by Abdu'l-Bahá, which are before Secret of Divine Civilization, I suppose, especially, we again have this parallel. With the Secret of
Very
Divine
interesting.
Civilization, of course, Baha'u'llah's asked him to write it, so it's much more, a world,
Yes.
an outward-oriented writing.
Yes.
But with Baha'u'llah, after the Aqdas, you have the more outward-oriented texts, and the proclamation of the kings, the Aqdas, and then
Yes.
the more outward. And similarly with Abdu'l-Bahá, you get a lot more of the outward-looking things in his trips to the West and then afterwards. But of course, philosophy weaves through everything by both Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Bahá in all their periods.
Yeah, a very interesting parallel. Thank you so much for sharing it. The only thing is that Baha'u'llah wrote the tablets to the kings. Basically, he wrote some of them when he was in Edirne, and he sent them in early Akka period before writing the Kitab.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, that was one of the things that struck me. And Lena Zain just asked, where can we find the commentary on the Basmalah?
Oh, commentary of the Bismillah. I know where she can find the original Arabic. I can share it with you. Because I have
you can always email it to me or something, because I think I have Lena's email address, or she can.
It's in one of the volumes of Makatib Abdu'l-Bahá in Persian and Arabic. Yeah.
Interesting. One of the points I think you made in your chapter, which I was curious about, is that you had mentioned that the only tablet that Abdu'l-Bahá calls Loh or Al-Vah is his Will and Testament.
Yes.
Where Shoghi Effendi, of course, uses the word tablet in English to describe Abdu'l-Bahā's writings. I don't know if he ever uses the word Loh to describe Abdu'l-Bahā's writings in Persian.
Yeah, he does.
He does.
Yes.
Okay, that's interesting.
Actually, one of the things that I had to share regarding his talks, Abdu'l-Bahā's speeches, I have quoted in my chapter, there is this very important passage from The Guardian in one of his Persian writings, in which he says that basically the New World Order, Baha'u'llah's New World Order, is based on the laws of the Kitab Aqdas and the spiritual and administrative principles that Abdu'l-Bahá expressed and wrote about in his tablets, Al-Vah in Persian, and in his speeches, which means the speeches are so important that The Guardian puts them next to the tablets of Al-Vah.
That's interesting.
They're very interesting, And then together, they are the sources for the spiritual and administrative principles of the new world order of Baha'u'llah.
Interesting. We're getting some questions now, and I do have, I think, one more question I wanted to ask you about, and then I'll return to other people's questions. We have some time left. You mentioned the CRCA,
Yes.
the treatise on politics.
Yeah.
And I'm aware of the fact that people have translated CRCA in other ways. And I was wondering if you would like to comment at all about some of the, I gather that the CRCA has been translated now by the World Center, and eventually it's going to be made available, which will be fantastic. But I was wondering if you'd like to comment further about any of the disagreements or comments about the meaning of the text.
Very good. Thank you so much for asking that, Rob. Well, I strongly believe that CRCA must be translated as the treatise on politics. It is politics in Persian, and unlike the claims of some scholars that during those times, if Abdu'l-Bahá wanted to talk about politics, he would have used the word, the Persian version of the word politik. No, that's not true. He really meant politics. Why? In a tablet that is now that is published actually in the first page of a later publication of the treatise of on politics in 1931, I guess, or 34, early 1930s. This tablet that I think who incorporated it at the beginning of the treatise of politics was, very intelligent soul. Abdu'l-Bahá explains what the content of the tablet is. He says in this treatise, I have described the relations between the rulers and the ruled. How do you describe it in English? Isn't that politics?
Yeah.
The relationship between the rulers and the ruled, and there are many other words that he uses to convey the same meaning. For example, the relationship between the Sa'is and Masus, which is again the one who applies politics and the one who receives politics. You can translate those Arabic words in this. So I totally go with the translation of the title to the treatise on politics. And it also, of course, has implications in understanding this whole non-interference in political affairs that I firmly believe, based on the text of Baha'u'llah, that existed, this notion existed during the time of Baha'u'llah. It's not something that was created later on by Shoghi Effendi, as has sometimes been claimed. So my insistence on translation of the title to Treatise on Politics also has to do with that issue.
Interesting. Thank you. Nima Rafi'i is going to ask a few questions, which are marvelous questions, I think. He asks, for example, about the commentary on the Surat al-Kahf. He says that his impression reading the commentary is that Abdu'l-Bahá was in the presence of Baha'u'llah whilst it was being composed, and that perhaps Baha'u'llah was directly informing or inspiring the content. And he was wondering if you have any comments about that.
That might have been the case, but I have not read the tablet with that idea in mind, so I better not speak about something just, without any prior research, but very interesting point.
Do we know how many letters of Abdu'l-Bahá written during Baha'u'llah's lifetime have been translated by Shoghi Effendi?
I don't know. Maybe the research department of the Universal House of Justice does have such very detailed and exact information. I don't.
How much research and scholarship has been done on the Arabic writings of Abdu'l-Bahá, and would you suggest any potential lines of inquiry or subjects to take up in this regard?
So myriads of them, really. The writings of Abdu'l-Bahá are oceans, oceans. I'm not saying this just as a believer. I mean, you give the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá to anyone who can read Arabic and Persian, and invite them to make a list of the themes that are included. It's fascinating. And so really, I mean, what we choose to do research on, of course, has a lot to do with our personal preferences, our life circumstances, our goals, the kind of service that we want to render not just the Baha'i community, but the whole world. So the possibilities are endless.
Interesting. Here's a question of mine that pops up as a result of your comment. You didn't mention the tablets Abdu'l-Bahá wrote in pure Persian. I was wondering if you have anything to say about that, because that, of course, is a truly remarkable achievement. It's like trying to write English without any Arab, any Latinate or French words, which is impossible, but I can't say impossible because that's French. It's difficult, but I can't say difficult because that's French.
That's correct. Thank you so much, Rob. Yeah, I mean, this should have been mentioned. I fully agree with you. And so Abdu'l-Bahá, even in that, he basically was following Baha'u'llah, because Baha'u'llah does have tablets in pure Persian, Farsi Sare. So yes, Abdu'l-Bahá also has pieces of writing. He also has prayers in pure Persian, and some of those tablets in pure Persian are addressed to the friends coming from a Zoroastrian background. Actually, he relates to them much more successfully and powerfully, I think, when he writes in pure Persian. And in terms of, that takes me to another topic that I did not cover in my talk, but now that you raised this issue of pure Persian, which is an indication of Abdu'l-Bahā's mastery of Persian language and Persian literature, this basically takes me to a topic that I did not discuss, but now I take the opportunity to share with you. I'm going to talk to you about the impression of two specialists in Persian literature. One is Amin Banani, that I think his article on the overview that he wrote in 1971 on the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá, it's published in word order. I guess it will be the best piece of writings on the topic for decades to come.
Yeah.
Not only now, but also for decades to come. The reason is that Banani was a great scholar, and as a scholar of Persian literature, his description of the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá, let me read a little bit of what he wrote, and I've quoted in my article. Banani emphasizes Abdu'l-Bahā's use of a literary technique known as saj, that is rhymed prose, to introduce rhyme and rhythm in his Persian prose, and that gave it what Banani calls architectural placidity, and rendered it memorable. We as Baha'is do want to memorize the writings, right? Not only prayers, but also the writings. So Banani's point is really interesting, that this rhyming nature of the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá makes them, renders them memorable. And then he talks about the images, particularly those pertaining to the natural world, mythology, religious stories abound in his prose. And Dr. Rasikh, the other specialist in Persian literature, say that, I think he has the authority really based on his specialty to say this. He says that the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá, along with the writings of Baha'u'llah, quote, open a new chapter in Persian literature.
Mhm.
They
Yeah.
open a new chapter, and it is really regrettable that their works, the writings of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Bahá, have been largely ignored, not only by Persian-speaking public, but also by the majority of scholars of Persian literary history.
Yeah. 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 And I'm sure that will not continue the case in the future when their writings will be much more highly respected in the general field of Persian literature. That would be my hope, at least.
Yeah.
I think we don't appreciate in English this rhyming nature, and we get a feel for it a little bit in the writings of Shoghi Effendi in English. Shoghi Effendi often has that quality in his English language writings, but otherwise it's just not normally done in scholarly writing. The nearest equivalent I can think of otherwise is rap. And rap, of course, is a very different kind of literary form, but it has a poetic feel to it that in the original languages that we don't really often appreciate. Another question that we have, again from Nima, where does the tablet of visitation of Abdu'l-Bahá come from? What's the history of that tablet?
I have not done research on in which circumstances he wrote or revealed that tablet. So anything that I can say would be just my guess, and I prefer not to share that. But Nima, you were asking me about good topics to research on. That is something that scholars such as yourself can do, I think, and it would be very useful for everybody. Thank you.
Yeah. The writings of Abdu'l-Bahá generally have been less thoroughly researched and studied than the writings of Baha'u'llah,
You mean
which
in English?
in
You mean
English. And in
okay.
turn, the writings of the Bab, I would say, have been studied even more than the writings of Baha'u'llah, or maybe similar in amount in English. But the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá less so. And this is a gap in our literature in English very much, I think. And perhaps part of the reason is because Abdu'l-Bahá wrote so many short things. And with Baha'u'llah, you can write about the longer pieces. But how many tablets of Baha'u'llah do we have that we haven't even know? No, thousands we don't even know about in detail.
Right. So, speaking about the research on the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá, fortunately, the secret of divine civilization has attracted a lot of scholarly attention.
Yeah.
So fantastic work has already been done in it, and the nature of the work is such that because the work is multi-layered, multifaceted, and it lends itself to a variety of studies, including literary, historical, religious, philosophical, sociological, sociopolitical. It is a fantastic source for all these kind of studies when it comes to combined Baha'i studies and studies in the history and culture of Iran.
Fantastic. We have time for maybe one more question, and I don't see any more at the moment, unfortunately. I think we may have possibly used them up. Nima does say thank you very much. I'm glad to be here and to have listened to your presentation. And of course, we're always delighted to have people ask these kinds of questions, and Nima in particular, with all of the research that he's been doing. And
Nima Jan, it's time for young scholars such as yourself to continue all the work that has been done and to answer the questions that you raised.
One person has just written, want to thank you very much. Very much thank you to the speaker. Excellent presentation.
Oh, thank you.
I can certainly echo that. I very much agree. It's nice to have a thorough presentation about the writings of Abdu'l-Bahá that fits not in 10 hours and not in 10 minutes, but in that intermediate length of time where people can sit and listen to the whole thing and get a picture, of the whole thing. And that's something that we've, I think, all badly needed in English. And Amin Banani, like you said, was the first who really provided us a really
Fantastic.
excellent overview. But now, 30 years later, there's more that can be said, and
Yes.
more that's available in English, even for that matter, with
Yes.
this new
Yeah.
translation.
Yeah.
So this really has been very helpful, Mina, and thank you very much for joining us. I
Yeah.
think we might as well wrap up now, since I know there's another presentation coming onto this Zoom
Yeah.
channel in a matter of minutes for
Yeah.
practice
Yeah.
purposes.
And
So
Rob, may I say something to Lena? I'm going to email Lena with the source for Abdu'l-Bahá's commentary on Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, which
good,
is one of the makatib.
good. And someone just asked where we can read Amin Banani's comments,
Oh,
and you can find that, of course, it's in a World Order magazine. Lena says thank you. World Order magazine that came out on the 50th anniversary of
yes,
the passing. So that was
71.
1971, the late 71, 50 years ago. It's hard to believe. And it was an excellent article. If you go to Baha'i.works, yes, WORKS is indeed an extension now on the web, Baha'i.works, you can find all of World Order magazine, and then you can go through it and you can find the fall of 1971 issue, and you can find it there. And so it's available now at Baha'i.works. And as are hundreds of other gems that have been published in World Order, for that matter. So again, Mina, thank you so much for this
You're very
marvelous
welcome. Thank you for the
presentation.
opportunity.
Great success, and we want to thank our audience for attending, and we hope to hear from you in the future, and come join us on this issue of racial unity in another half an hour. And of course, next week we will hear from Bahariye Ma'ani about women and the changing roles of women in the ministry of Abdu'l-Bahá.
Sorry, Rob. Fatima Al-Saleh wants also an email regarding Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Fatima, would you please send me an email? Search my name, and I teach at EKU. You will find my email address. Send me an email, and I will respond to you with the source. Sorry.
Yeah, EKU being Eastern Kentucky University. And
Yeah.
you can always just simply write to the Wilmette Institute, and we can forward the question on to Mina as well. So there's the registration link for the next program. I think at this point we can really wrap it up and thank everyone.
Thank
You
you.
again for coming and enjoying this presentation. We look forward to seeing you all at our next program. And we're, of course, doing quite a lot of programs. So we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you. Bye-bye.